Dalton Keene believed he was acquiring an unoccupied dwelling. However, upon forcing open the weathered entrance, a pair of surprised emerald eyes regarded him from the opposite end of the interior. Within 30 seconds, all his aspirations for a new existence would be irrevocably shattered. The dawn sunlight stretched long shadows through the coniferous trees as Dalton steered his conveyance up the serpentine path towards what was intended to be his fresh beginning. He had acquired the secluded cabin with his final reserves of currency, without prior inspection, from a proprietor in town, desperate for immediate funds. The legal documentation confirming his ownership of this isolated parcel of frontier territory rested folded within his vest. Having forfeited his ranch to creditors 3 months prior, this humble abode represented his sole opportunity for restoration. His roughened hands tightened their grip on the reins as he approached the modest wooden edifice. Smoke curled from the chimney. Dalton's spirits plummeted. Someone was consuming his fuel, residing in his cabin, treating his possessions as if they were their own. He had invested every last cent he possessed in this location, and now he would be compelled to contend for what rightfully belonged to him. Dismounting from the wagon, Dalton squared his shoulders and advanced towards the principal doorway. The timber showed signs of wear, but remained robust. Furthermore, through the solitary pane of glass, he could discern activity within. His jaw tightened. Whoever had taken up residence here would swiftly discover that he was not a man to be exploited. He had toiled too diligently and endured too many losses to permit someone to pilfer what little remained to him. Dispensing with the courtesy of a knock, Dalton propelled the door inward and entered. The interior was tidy, well kept, adorned with subtle domestic embellishments that took him by surprise. Wild blossoms graced a receptacle on the wooden surface, and the aroma of freshly baked sustenance permeated the air. Yet, what halted him abruptly was the young woman standing near the hearth, her extensive auburn tresses illuminated by the morning luminescence filtering through the window. She turned with deliberate slowness, and their gazes met. She possessed a captivating beauty, the sort that could make gentlemen forget their own appellations, but her verdant eyes conveyed a resolute defiance, warning him that she would not be easily cowed. She was attired in a simple azure garment that bore the marks of considerable use. Nevertheless, she carried herself with an understated dignity, despite being discovered in circumstances that were clearly not her own. "You must be the new proprietor," she stated, her voice unwavering despite the fleeting surprise that had crossed her countenance. "I anticipated your arrival." Dalton removed his hat, uncertain why he felt an obligation to exhibit deference towards an individual who was, in essence, an interloper. "Ma'am, I am Dalton Keene. I purchased this cabin and possess the pertinent documents as confirmation." She inclined her head gradually, as if she had previously heard these precise assertions. "I am Coral Lane, and before you instruct me to depart," she paused, her eyes meeting his directly, "you should be aware that I am unable to do so." The unvarnished certainty in her intonation sent an unsettling tremor down Dalton's spine. This was not the response of someone apprehended in the act of illicitly occupying shelter. This indicated something entirely different, something that suggested his predicaments were merely commencing. However, what Dalton had yet to ascertain was the reason a woman such as Coral would elect to inhabit such a remote locale alone, or what it was that she concealed, rendering departure an impossibility. Dalton placed his hat upon the table, endeavoring to maintain composure in his vocalization, despite the mounting frustration within his chest. "Miss Lane, I am unconcerned with any arrangement you may have had with the prior occupant. I hold legal documentation, and this is now my property." Cora moved away from the hearth, her hands clasped before her. "I comprehend your stance, Mr. Keene, but there are aspects of this location that you are not yet privy to, factors that fundamentally alter the situation." Dalton retrieved the deed from his vest pocket and laid it upon the table, separating them. "Whatever narrative you intend to present, I have encountered worse. I have endured greater losses." A subtle expression flickered across Cora's features. Not apprehension, but something akin to commiseration. "I have no doubt you have, but this is not a matter of finances or legal instruments. This concerns survival." Dalton scrutinized her visage, searching for indications of duplicity. She did not resemble the vagrants or charlatans he had encountered in town. Her garments were clean, her hair neatly plaited, and the cabin exhibited evidence of diligent upkeep. Someone had bestowed genuine care upon this dwelling, not merely utilized it as a temporary refuge. "Survival for whom?" he inquired, his voice softening unintentionally. Before Cora could formulate a response, a sound originating from outside caused both individuals to freeze, the rhythmic clatter of hooves approaching with haste, multiple equestrians judging by the sound. Cora's countenance turned ashen, and she moved with alacrity towards the window, taking care to remain concealed behind the drape. "How many individuals were aware of your intended arrival today?" she inquired in a hushed tone, her preceding equanimity entirely dissipated. "No one. I maintained discretion regarding the acquisition." Dalton joined her at the window, and through the intervening foliage, he could discern 3 men mounted on horseback ascending the trail. They rode with evident purpose, not in the manner of casual itinerants. "Do you recognize those individuals?" Cora's hands trembled as she grasped the window frame. "I had hoped they would never locate this place." The foremost rider was an imposing figure with a dark beard, adorned with a gun belt bearing the marks of extensive utilization. The other 2 flanked him as if soldiers executing directives. They had not arrived for a social engagement. "Miss Lane," Dalton stated softly, "what precisely are you attempting to evade?" She turned to face him, and for the first instant since his arrival, her defiance faltered. "My husband, or rather, the man who perceives himself to be my owner." Dalton's stomach churned. A married woman in flight from her husband fundamentally altered the complexion of this predicament. However, the terror emanating from her eyes indicated that this was not a matter of a simple marital disagreement. "He is not the sort of man who readily accepts refusal," Cora continued, her voice barely audible, "and he possesses resources that surpass those of ordinary individuals." The cadence of the approaching hooves grew nearer. Dalton found himself instinctively positioning himself protectively between Cora and the doorway, though he could not articulate the reason for this impulse. Mere moments earlier, he had been disposed to expel her himself. "They are nearly here," Cora whispered. Yet, what remained unknown to both of them was that the lead rider had been pursuing Cora for weeks, and he harbored no intention of departing empty-handed. The riders halted before the cabin, their steeds snorting and stamping restlessly from the arduous journey. Dalton could discern the creak of leather as the men dismounted, their spurs jingling against the porch steps. "Remain behind me," Dalton whispered to Cora, surprised by his own emergent protective inclination. Earlier that morning, he had desired her departure. Now, the entire dynamic felt irrevocably altered. A forceful series of knocks reverberated against the door. "Open up!" "We know you are inside, Cora." The voice belonged to the bearded gentleman, and it carried the unmistakable authority of one accustomed to immediate compliance. Cora's respiration became more rapid, and Dalton could sense her palpable fear as if it were a living entity within the confines of the small dwelling. "What would you like me to convey to them?" Dalton inquired quietly. "Nothing," Cora breathed. "Do not permit them to ascertain that you have observed me." However, it was regrettably too late. The doorknob turned, and the trio of men entered without invitation. The leader's gaze swept across the cabin, immediately locating Cora, positioned behind Dalton. A chilling smile spread across his weathered visage. "There you are, my dear. You have led us on quite a pursuit." Dalton stepped forward, interposing himself between the man and Cora. "This is private property. You are trespassing." The bearded man's attention shifted to Dalton, appraising him with the intensity of a predator assessing a potential threat. "I am Marcus Webb. That woman behind you is my wife, and she is returning home with me." "I am not your wife," Cora stated, regaining her voice. "That union was coerced, and you are well aware of that." Marcus's smile remained unyielding, but a dangerous glint flickered within his eyes. "The law dictates otherwise, and the law is paramount in these territories." Dalton felt the tangible presence of his firearm against his hip, but the prospect of confronting 3 individuals alone presented unfavorable odds, particularly when he lacked a complete understanding of the cause for which he was contending. "The lady states she has no desire to accompany you." Marcus emphasized the word lady with a mocking inflection. "The lady has no recourse. She is my property, akin to livestock or possessions." The unvarnished cruelty embedded in those pronouncements caused Dalton's jaw to clench. He had encountered individuals like Marcus previously. Those who believed their power granted them the prerogative to possess other human beings. No one belongs to anyone else. One of Marcus's associates, a gaunt man with a dispassionate gaze, moved to flank Dalton. "Boss, we could simply retrieve her. This rancher is outnumbered." However, Marcus raised a hand, his gaze still fixed upon Dalton. "You appear to be a sensible individual. Withdraw from this matter, and no harm will befall anyone. This is a domestic affair, not your concern." Dalton could perceive Cora trembling behind him, yet she neither fled nor implored. Whatever transgressions had occurred between her and Marcus, she remained resolute in confronting the situation with fortitude. "I acquired this cabin through legal means," Dalton stated. "Miss Lane is my guest. Consequently, this is now my concern." Marcus's expression darkened considerably. "Your guest? Precisely how long have you known my wife?" The inquiry was laden with implications that sent a frigid wave through Dalton's veins. Marcus was not merely pursuing a fugitive spouse. He was actively seeking justifications for whatever actions he intended to inflict upon her. "Long enough to discern that she will not venture to any location against her will," Dalton responded. Marcus inclined his head slowly, as if confirming a pre-existing conclusion. "I had hoped we could resolve this in a civil manner, but it appears you have chosen to intercede in affairs that do not pertain to you." The thin man's hand drifted closer to his firearm, but Marcus had already made a determinative choice that would irrevocably alter the destinies of all present. Marcus stepped back and gestured to his companions. "Set fire to it." The words struck Dalton with the force of a physical blow. "What? You heard correctly?" Marcus's voice was casual, as if he were ordering a beverage. "If my wife prefers this cabin to her proper abode, then perhaps she requires a demonstration of the consequences for dwellings that harbor errant wives." The gaunt individual immediately advanced towards the fireplace, retrieving an ember. Cora emitted a gasp from behind Dalton, and he felt a visceral surge, a breaking point within his very being. This was no longer a mere contest over property. This was a confrontation rooted in fundamental human decency. "If you set this cabin ablaze, you're annihilating my entire livelihood," Dalton declared, his hand instinctively reaching for the firearm holstered at his hip. "I poured every last resource I possessed into establishing this homestead." Marcus offered a dismissive shrug. "Should have stayed out of it." The third individual, who had remained utterly silent until this moment, drew his own weapon and leveled it directly at Dalton's chest. "The boss requires you to stand down. My advice is to comply." Dalton's thoughts churned furiously. 3 adversaries armed to the teeth, facing a solitary defender and a woman to safeguard. Yet, a fragment of Cora's earlier pronouncements resonated in his memory. This ordeal transcended a simple marital discord. It was a stark battle for survival. "Mr. Keene," Cora's voice was a soft plea, "allow me to depart with them. Do not sacrifice all that you have because of me." But as Dalton's gaze shifted back to her, he witnessed something that fundamentally altered his perspective. Cora's hands were pressed protectively against her abdomen, and in that instant, her loosely draped attire acquired a profound clarity. She wasn't merely fleeing from Marcus. She was safeguarding something infinitely more precious. "No," Dalton stated with unwavering resolve, pivoting to confront Marcus once more. "She remains here." Marcus's eyes followed Dalton's unwavering stare to Cora. As comprehension dawned upon his features, his expression contorted into one of pure malevolence. "You presume that infant is yours, stranger?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, potent as any venom. Dalton recognized instantly that Marcus was crafting a narrative to legitimize any atrocity he might commit against them both. "The child is not his," Cora asserted, her voice gaining a newfound strength. "And it is not yours either, Marcus. You are fully aware of that." Marcus's face flushed crimson with fury. "Everything about you belongs to me, encompassing whatever is gestating within you." The chilling nonchalance of those words solidified Dalton's resolve. He had already surrendered his ranch, his savings, and a significant portion of his optimism over the preceding months. However, he refused to abandon his very humanity by passively witnessing a defenseless, pregnant woman being abducted by a fiend. Dalton's grip tightened around the worn handle of his pistol. "She's not leaving," he stated resolutely. That is final. The gaunt man, clutching a burning log, let out a sardonic chuckle. 3 firearms against 1. Are you entirely certain about this, Cowboy? Marcus raised his hand once more, scrutinizing Dalton with a fresh intensity. Actually, I have a more engaging proposition. Given your eagerness to play the hero, let us elevate the stakes. But the course of action Marcus proposed next would undoubtedly test the very foundations of Dalton's understanding of valor. A smile, devoid of any warmth, touched Marcus's lips. Here is the arrangement, Cowboy. You and I shall resolve this dispute in a manner befitting men. 1 pistol, a contest of equitable odds. If you prevail, I shall depart and cease all interference in Cora's affairs. Should you emerge victorious? Dalton inquired. When I win, Marcus corrected him, his tone laced with anticipation. Cora returns with me, and you will be interred in that remarkably soft soil bordering your cabin. Cora stepped forward, her countenance pallid, yet imbued with an unyielding determination. No, I cannot permit you to perish on my behalf, Mr. Keene. We are, after all, strangers. Yet Dalton's thoughts dwelled on the tender way she had cradled her belly, the stark terror reflected in her eyes at Marcus's arrival, and the quiet dignity with which she confronted an insurmountable predicament. Perhaps he did not grasp the entirety of her narrative, but he comprehended enough. I understand you are carrying a child who merits a father far removed from his nature, Dalton declared, his gaze locked onto Marcus. Marcus's jaw muscles tensed. That child will be instilled with discipline and respect, much like its mother ought to have been. The manner in which Marcus spoke of the unborn child, as if it were mere property to be subjugated rather than a nascent life to be nurtured, sent a chilling wave through Dalton. He had witnessed firsthand the cruelty inflicted by men like Marcus upon children incapable of defending themselves. You harbor trepidation in confronting me single-handedly, Dalton ventured, deliberately provoking Marcus. Hence your reliance on hired enforcers. Marcus's countenance darkened ominously, and he gestured for his companions to withdraw. Clear the porch. This will conclude swiftly. As the 2 men moved towards the exterior, Cora grasped Dalton's arm urgently. He possesses a deceptive speed and a history of lethal encounters. I have personally witnessed his capacity for violence. Dalton covered her hand with his, a surprising sense of rightness accompanying the gesture. What is the genuine account of your circumstances, Ka? Why did you consent to marry him? Tears welled in her eyes, though she resolutely refused to let them fall. My father incurred a substantial debt to Marcus, a sum he was unable to repay. Marcus presented an offer. He would waive the debt in exchange for my hand. Her father was in his final days, and she could not bear the thought of him succumbing to his medical obligations, leaving him destitute. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Kay had not merely been bartered into matrimony, she had selflessly offered herself to rescue her family from ruin. And now, she was protecting her unborn child in the only manner available to her. The infant's father, Dalton inquired gently, a man of inherent goodness who passed away before he could learn of the child's existence. Marcus, upon discovering Cora's pregnancy, had decreed that the child would be his sole heir, irrespective of the child's own desires regarding paternal lineage. Dalton nodded, the complete picture now starkly clear. This was not a matter of possessions or personal pride. It was a desperate struggle by a woman to shield her progeny from a predator who viewed human beings as mere acquisitions. Marcus's voice carried from the exterior. Our time has expired, Cowboy. Let us ascertain the true measure of your character. However, as Dalton moved towards the doorway, Cora whispered a revelation that completely upended his understanding of the situation. Cora's hushed words caused Dalton to halt abruptly. Marcus is not merely my husband. He is the man responsible for your brother's demise. Dalton's blood turned to ice. His brother, Samuel, had been discovered lifeless on a secluded path 6 months prior, his horse and provisions pilfered. The local sheriff had attributed the death to random brigands, but the investigation had stalled, yielding no witnesses or definitive clues. Samuel Keene was your brother. Cora's voice was barely a whisper. I overheard Marcus boasting to his men about dispatching a rancher who refused to relinquish his water rights. He described the man's features, his steed, even the distinctive scar on his hand, resulting from a childhood mishap. Dalton's vision swam with a potent rage. Samuel's passing had been the calamitous event that compelled him to divest himself of all his possessions and seek refuge in this isolated cabin. Marcus had not only shattered Cora's life, but had also annihilated Dalton's family. "Are you absolutely certain?" Dalton's voice emerged as a guttural growl. "He retained your brother's timepiece, the one bearing inscribed initials on the interior. He displayed it to me as a demonstration of the fate befalling those who dared to defy him." Dalton stepped out into the open, his hands remarkably steady on his firearm, despite the torrent of fury coursing through his veins. Marcus stood 20 paces distant, radiating an aura of unshakable confidence and relaxation, while his two henchmen observed from the porch, their expressions alight with eager anticipation. "Before we commence," Dalton called out, his voice resonating with a newfound intensity, "speak of Samuel Keene." Marcus's composed demeanor faltered for a fleeting moment. "Never heard of him. Rancher who refused to cede his water rights. Met his end on the North Trail 6 months ago." A genuine smile now graced Marcus's lips, the veneer of civility completely discarded. "Ah, Samuel Keene, a stubborn fool who valued his principles above his existence." The candid admission struck Dalton with the force of a physical blow, yet it also furnished him with something he had desperately craved for months: absolute certainty. This was no longer solely about protecting Cora. It was about avenging Samuel. "He was my brother." Marcus's smile broadened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Then this outcome is even more propitious than I had envisioned. I shall conclude the endeavor I initiated." The two men faced each other across the parched clearing, their hands poised above their respective weapons. Dalton could discern the frantic rhythm of his own heartbeat, but beneath it lay something more profound. Samuel's voice echoing from their shared childhood, imparting lessons on accurate marksmanship and the unwavering defense of what was right. "On 3, Marcus announced, his voice laced with a chilling anticipation. 1, Dalton's mind became a crystal-clear focus, zeroing in on the man who had brutally murdered his brother and inflicted unspeakable torment upon an innocent woman. 2. Time seemed to stretch and warp as both men's hands moved with lightning speed towards their firearms. 3. The clearing erupted with the deafening roar of gunfire. Marcus was swift, possessing a speed that surpassed most adversaries Dalton had ever encountered. However, the potent combination of profound grief and righteous indignation had honed Dalton's reflexes to a razor's edge. As the dissipating smoke revealed the scene, Marcus Webb lay motionless upon the dusty earth, his weapon still partially drawn. But as Dalton stood over the individual responsible for his brother's demise, Marcus's remaining 2 enforcers emerged from the porch, their firearms already at the ready. The slender man's weapon was trained on Dalton's chest before he could even register the threat. "The boss may be deceased, but you still ended his life. That renders you a wanted man." Dalton's firearm was now depleted, and the agonizing seconds required for a reload were a luxury he could not afford. The 2 men advanced with deliberate slowness, savoring their perceived advantage. "Should have stayed out of it, Cowboy," the 3rd man taunted. "Now you will face the consequences for your interference." But before either of the remaining adversaries could squeeze their triggers, a sharp report echoed from the cabin window. The slender man recoiled, clutching his shoulder as he crumpled to the ground. Cora stood framed in the doorway, the seasoned grip of an old hunting rifle evident in her stance. "The subsequent discharge will not be a mere warning," she stated with unnerving calmness. The sole remaining gunman whirled towards her, but Dalton seized the momentary diversion to dive behind Marcus's fallen form and swiftly reload his weapon. As he surged back into a firing position, the last of Marcus's men was already in frantic retreat towards his horse. Dalton permitted him to escape. A solitary witness, capable of recounting the events, might ultimately serve their interests. Cora lowered the rifle and approached the silent form of Marcus. She gazed down at the man who had held dominion over her existence for months, and Dalton anticipated witnessing a wave of relief or perhaps satisfaction. Instead, her expression conveyed only profound exhaustion. "It is finished," she murmured softly. Yet, Dalton was meticulously examining Marcus's body, and something about the situation did not quite align. Kay, you mentioned Marcus possessed my brother's timepiece. She nodded affirmatively. He habitually wore it on a chain, as if it were a memento of his conquest. Dalton knelt and meticulously searched Marcus's vest, his fingers closing around the familiar silver watch that had once belonged to their father before being passed down to Samuel. Its rediscovery evoked a vivid cascade of cherished memories. Christmas mornings, arduous cattle drives, the day Samuel had proudly inherited it. However, as Dalton opened the watch's case, he discovered an unexpected inclusion. Within, nestled alongside the initials SK, meticulously etched by their father, lay a folded piece of parchment. "What is it?" Cora inquired, her voice laced with curiosity. Dalton carefully unfolded the paper. It was a crudely drawn map, rendered in Samuel's distinctive handwriting, meticulously marking a location nestled within the northern mountains. At the bottom of the map, Samuel had penned a message for his brother. "For my brother Dalton, should anything befall me." Dalton understood that Marcus was intending to end his life. He realized this and concealed the message, anticipating I would eventually retrieve the timepiece. Kay drew nearer to scrutinize the chart. "What, in your estimation, was his objective in having you locate this?" he inquired. Before Dalton could offer a response, the distinct sound of approaching equines caused both individuals to cease their actions abruptly. Additional riders were ascending the thoroughfare, progressing with considerable celerity. "The individual who made his escape," Cora stated. "He must have departed to solicit assistance." However, as the riders materialized from the dense foliage, Dalton observed a detail that fundamentally altered his perception of the situation. The foremost rider bore the insignia of a sheriff, and accompanying him were 6 armed law enforcement officers. "That is indeed Sheriff Morrison," Cora conveyed in a hushed tone. "He has been actively searching for me since my supposed abduction. Marcus had informed him that I was taken by brigands." Dalton's gaze shifted from the deceased individual, Marcus Webb, to the expectant woman standing adjacent to him, clutching a firearm that was still emitting wisps of smoke. Within approximately 30 seconds, he would be compelled to provide an explanation to the sheriff regarding the termination of a man presumed to be of good standing and why he was providing refuge to a woman who had been forcibly held. Yet, the parchment concealed within his grasp suggested that Samuel had bequeathed to him more than merely a hint concerning his demise. Sheriff Morrison dismounted with deliberate slowness, his time-worn visage absorbing the entirety of the unfolding tableau. The lifeless form of Marcus, the injured gunman propelling himself towards his mount, and Cora's posture beside Dalton, rifle in hand. "Miss Cora," the sheriff addressed her with measured caution, "Marcus Webb had reported your disappearance, asserting that you had been taken. He indicated he was mobilizing a search contingent." Cora stepped forward, her voice exhibiting a remarkable steadiness and clarity. "Sheriff Morrison, Marcus Webb coerced me into matrimony to settle my father's outstanding medical obligations. Upon my discovery of my pregnancy with another man's child, his demeanor became hostile. I fled to ensure the safety of my unborn infant." The sheriff's attention then gravitated towards Marcus Webb's fallen form. "And this gentleman," Dalton interjected, his hand producing the watch. "Marcus Webb murdered my brother Samuel 6 months prior. He retained this as a token of his accomplishment." Miss Lane had inadvertently overheard him boasting about it. Sheriff Morrison meticulously examined the timepiece, readily recognizing the etched initials and the unique markings that Samuel had frequently lamented. "I recall this particular watch. Samuel was never without it." Dalton continued. "Marcus also attempted to incinerate my legally acquired dwelling and issued threats against Miss Lane and her soon-to-be-born child. I challenged him to a direct confrontation, and he accepted." The injured gunman, now mounted upon his horse, implored with evident desperation, "Sheriff, they have dispatched Mr. Webb summarily. He was endeavoring to secure his wife's retrieval." However, Cora had already proceeded to her satchel within the cabin and returned bearing a sheaf of documents. "These are the matrimonial agreements that Marcus compelled my ailing father to execute. You will find the details of the financial obligations and the explicit threats penned by Marcus himself." Sheriff Morrison perused the documents, his expression progressively hardening. "These are not legitimate marital contracts. These are instruments of extortion. The injured gunman, recognizing the imminent collapse of his fabricated account, spurred his steed towards the tree line, but 2 deputies were already in motion to intercept him. The pertinent inquiry, Sheriff Morrison articulated, is the course of action moving forward. Dalton unfurled Samuel's chart and presented it to the sheriff. My brother entrusted this to me moments before his passing. It delineates the location of evidence he had amassed concerning Marcus's illicit enterprises, pilfered water rights, slain homesteaders, families subjected to duress. Samuel was investigating Marcus, the sheriff inquired, evidently for a period of months. He was aware that Marcus would eventually cause his demise, so he meticulously documented every transgression and secreted it where only I would discern its location. 3 days hence, guided by Samuel's chart, they unearthed a comprehensive record detailing Marcus Webb's criminal activities, concealed within a cavern situated to the north of the cabin. The accumulated evidence implicated numerous officials engaged in corrupt practices and facilitated the recovery of expropriated assets valued in the many thousands of dollars. Cora's union with Marcus was subsequently invalidated by the territorial judiciary. The same tribunal awarded her restitution from Marcus's confiscated assets, a sum sufficient to guarantee her child's future financial security. 6 months later, Dalton stood on the veranda of his reconstructed dwelling, observing Cora as she suspended articles of clothing on the clothesline under the morning sun. Her pregnancy was now quite apparent, and her movements possessed the deliberate grace of a woman cherishing precious life within. She glanced upward, noticing his gaze. The baby moved for the first time this morning. Dalton offered a smile, still astounded by the profound transformation his existence had undergone. He had acquired this dwelling with the expectation of solitary confinement, nursing his sorrow and rebuilding from desolation. Instead, he had secured retribution for Samuel, protected an innocent woman, and discovered that often life's most valuable gifts arrive disguised as predicaments. "Have you settled on a name?" he inquired. Cora's hand rested gently on her abdomen. "Samuel. Should it be a boy, in honor of the man who facilitated all of this?" Dalton nodded, confident his brother would have approved of such a tribute. Samuel had consistently held the conviction that virtuous individuals gravitated towards one another when in dire need. Observing Cora now, secure, liberated, and preparing to usher new existence into the world, Dalton recognized his brother's prescience extended beyond merely Marcus Webb's transgressions. Some acquisitions, he mused, ultimately yield returns far exceeding their initial perceived worth.